and welcome to our coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Coming up today, flares illuminate the dark Gaza City sky as Israel prepares ground assault. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken meets with Arab leaders. Plus, Iranian Foreign Minister meets with Qatari leadership in Doha for talks on situation in Gaza. Thank you so much for joining us. Amidst fears of an expected Israeli ground offensive into Gaza, flares were seen illuminating the darkened skyline of the densely populated Palestinian enclave in the early hours of today. A massive fireball has been reported in Gaza after multiple airstrikes by the Israeli military, leaving several people dead in the last few hours. The expected Israeli ground offensive and air attacks have raised fears of unprecedented suffering in the narrow, impoverished Gaza Strip, one of the most crowded places in the world. Israel has urged exhausted Gazans to evacuate the south, which hundreds of thousands have already done in the enclave that is home to more than 2 million people. Hamas, which runs Gaza, has told people to ignore the Israeli directive. This morning in Ashkelon, that's in Israel, Israel's military, which has massed tanks on the Gaza border in preparation for an expected ground offensive, says it's targeting Hamas and its infrastructure in response to last week's deadly attacks. The military said Israeli aircraft on Sunday struck about 250 military targets, killing the Hamas Southern District commander. Israeli military Chief Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi told soldiers near the Gaza border they will be entering Gaza to root out Hamas, targeting every place, every commander, every operator. Meanwhile, the Israeli troops are also in position on the border area with Lebanon, seen this morning as hostilities with Hezbollah take place in parallel to the spiraling war in Gaza. A key player in the war, Iran has warned Israel of an escalation if it failed to end aggression against Palestinians. Its foreign minister said other parties in the region were also ready to act. But Washington is focused on avoiding a spillover of the conflict, especially with clashes with Lebanon escalating on Israel's border. Over the weekend, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken met with Arab leaders determined to stop the war from spreading. We'll now be showing you scenes from the North Gaza Jabalia refugee camp from Saturday, showing destruction caused to buildings and streets following Israeli airstrikes. Gaza has been under intense Israeli bombardments since the rampage by the militant terrorist group Hamas killed 1,300 people on October the 7th. Authorities in Gaza said at least 2,670 people have so far been killed by Israel's retaliatory strikes, a quarter of them children, and nearly 10,000 people wounded. Another 1,000 people were missing and believed to be hidden under the rubble. Now, Mr. Anthony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, has visited Arab states across the region in recent days. He is seeking to secure the release of 155 hostages, including Americans, Israel says, who were taken by Hamas back into Gaza. The U.S. Secretary of State arrived in Amman, Jordan on Sunday. He's expected to return to Israel today to talk about the way forward after several days of shuttle diplomacy between the Arab states, which he says shared the U.S. determination to ensure Israel's conflict with Palestinian militant terrorist group Hamas does not spill over elsewhere in the region. The top U.S. diplomat arrived in Israel on Thursday as it prepares a ground offensive in the Gaza Strip in retaliation for the deadly Hamas attack on civilians, and has also been to Qatar, to Jordan, to Bahrain, to the United Arab Emirates, to Saudi Arabia, and to Egypt. And as we mentioned earlier, Israel is preparing for a ground offensive against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, saying it will attack by land, by air, and by sea. It comes as the Israel Defense Forces warn 1.1 million Palestinians in North Gaza to evacuate south, and thousands have been fleeing by vehicle or on foot. Israel has also turned pipes into Gaza back on, in the southern part that is, having restricted supplies as part of its blockade. This was confirmed to White House Security Advisor Jake Sullivan.
It's Sunday, a week after the Hamas attacks on Israel and the Israeli airstrikes on Gaza, and a few days since Israel announced it is cutting food, fuel and water from the Gaza Strip. But on Sunday, Israel opens the water pipes into Gaza. Residents queue for water in Khan Yunis at water distribution stations. Israel's energy minister said the decision to renew water supplies to parts of southern Gaza was agreed on between Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. President Joe Biden. Hours before, Mr. Netanyahu vowed to demolish Hamas as his military prepares to move into the Gaza Strip in search of Islamist militants whose deadly rampage through Israeli border towns shocked the world. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant says Israel has no interest in waging war on its northern front, and that if the Lebanese group Hezbollah restrains itself, Israel would respect the situation along the border as it is today. He says sporadic fire across the Israeli-Lebanon border over the past week has raised concerns that fighting with Hamas militants in Gaza could escalate into a broader conflict. Meanwhile, several people were feared dead after an Israeli airstrike on a building in Gaza's Al-Shati refugee camp, as civil defense forces and residents worked on finding survivors. The Palestinian Health Ministry said early on Sunday that 300 people, mostly children and women, had been killed, and 800 more had been injured in Gaza during the last 24 hours.
Sources in Egypt say Cairo, Israel and the U.S. have agreed to a ceasefire in southern Gaza beginning at 600 Greenwich Mean Time, which will be coinciding with the reopening of the Rafah border crossing. It's unclear what exactly the situation is, as Hamas and Israel are yet to confirm this. The head of Hamas media office says they have no information about any humanitarian truce being agreed in southern Gaza, while a spokesman from Israel's military says he's unaware of any ceasefire in southern Gaza. At the Rafah border crossing this morning, crowds of people wanting to leave Gaza have gathered after reports suggest that it could be temporarily reopened. However, at the moment, the crossing remains closed.
We have put in place, and Egypt has put in place, a lot of material support for people in Gaza. And Rafah will be open. We're putting in place with the United Nations, with Egypt, with Israel, with others, the mechanism by which to get the assistance in.
Now, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has vowed his concern for peace-loving Palestinians who he says were suffering as a result of Hamas' violent terror attacks on Israel that has spiraled into a military conflict and humanitarian crisis. In his first time addressing Parliament on the matter, he reiterated Australia's support for Israel in defending itself against attacks of terror, but joined U.S. President Joe Biden's calls on Israel to exercise restraint and operate by the rules of war. He also strongly condemned anti-Semitic chants that were heard at pro-Palestine protests outside the Sydney Opera House last week. Thousands of Australians joined rallies on Sunday despite police threats to curb them as nations across the developed world clamp down on such protests out of concern the conflict could trigger violence at home.
Hamas is an enemy, but not just of Israel. Hamas is an enemy of all peace-loving Palestinian people who are left to pay a devastating price for this terrorism. Hamas honours no faith. It serves no cause but terror. It is no better than any other group in history that has clung to the twisted belief that victory can be built on the blood of the innocent. We should be very clear that it is Hamas that is the enemy, not the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people are suffering greatly, and this suffering has impacted on generations of Palestinians. There is no question that Israel has the right to defend itself against a terrorist organisation and to take strong action against it. But we join the calls of President Biden and other partners for Israel to operate by the rules of war. The awful anti-Semitism chanted by some of the protesters at the Sydney Opera House is beyond offensive. It is a betrayal of our Australian values. We reject it and we condemn it.
Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese now. Joining us is Defence and Security expert Mr. Onyekachi Adekoya. Good morning and welcome to the programme. If you can hear me, good morning and welcome to the programme.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, loud and clear. Thank you for being with us. Now, it was in 1772 that an English hymn writer wrote, "The ties that bind us are stronger than that which divides us." And that is more apparent now that there are divisions in the world precipitated by the Israel-Hamas conflict. From Amsterdam to South Africa to London to New York, anti-Semitic or pro-Palestinian groups have made their voices loud and clear whose side they're on, further exacerbating the divisions around the world. What is your impression on how this is unfolding in the Middle East?
The question, it's a difficult question to try to answer, but I guess to answer not too far back, maybe you look at the end of the Bible, a single liberal democratic power coming to force. Soviet Union, the world has seen a problem set, and basically you can look at the Middle East since 1973, the Yom Kippur War, the reason behind it, this political power between great powers is now coming to a head. If you even look at the recent crisis, is when the US and some Western powers claim that there is no linkage between what has happened and Iran, and what we don't see at the fore is that Iran has now become a major supplier, exporting almost 1 to 2 million barrels per day to China. So if the intelligence force will finger Iran, would impact China's energy security, and which will bring Beijing into the play. So a complex web of geopolitical power play between great powers and all political prediction of a major shift somewhat in 2024. All is headed towards that major epochal event to claim would lead to a reset of global monetary systems. So chaos, Some argue it's all just geopolitics. Some argue it's bad conflict management. Argue for a two-state solution being at the heart of the problem, but even the implementation of, because you have to then deal with the issue of what happens to Jerusalem. The Muslims have about, Christians have almost an equal amount, smacking in between. At the 80s, the traditional, it's not too easy to make a clear sense of what is happening in the world today. Politics transmuted in the form of war and greater politics at play, manifesting itself in different silo aspirations, which will eventually to a head in 2024, 2025, which again is the time that the US have predicted that maybe perhaps at Taiwan, but we seem to be going on that footing where one conflict reinforces the need for another conflict. I might add, because we are now experiencing what we call a global commodity super cycle, and supply chain crisis will lead to more chaos, which may now need further chaos to reinforce some hard. So you've asked a complex questions. I know I've not answered it. I don't intend to answer it. There's no straight answer to it. It's just to give an and hopefully maybe we'll find a way to make sense of the chaos.
Yes, Mr. Adekoya, we do apologize to our viewers. Your audio, your voice seems to be fading in and out, so we could barely hear some of the things you were saying. But as we try and fix that connection, I'd like to ask you about the Rafah crossing, which is the border with Egypt and the area where Hamas is. Now, we understand, and the Palestinians and the Gaza Strip, we understand that they're opening that they might open the Rafah crossing and it will not be announced. And we also know that it's been estimated that about 500,000 Gazans have fled that area as per the directions of the Israeli military forces. What we don't know is whether that ground offensive will begin anytime soon, although it's been telegraphed by Hamas. How do you think Egypt shall respond to this crisis, and how do you think it has been responding in not opening its borders thus far? And have we having to rely on whether or not they'll open their borders for the refugees who are fleeing this conflict zone?
I think if you look at Egypt, you probably look at the position that the Arab League has taken, which says that a resettlement, a relocation, a displacement of the Palestinians from Gaza is totally on the red line for the Arab League. Egypt, on its part, is doing what it thinks is necessary to protect its own inside Egypt, because once you allow the Rafah crossing to of internally displaced persons, creating some form of challenges for you. On the second hand, Egypt would not want to hurriedly be seen as giving the army an off-ramp, because once you open the Rafah crossing and every other crossing, then you are able to evacuate Gaza within within 1 to 2, 3 days, which is practically not possible. The Arab nations around the borders of Gaza, Israel, opening up their borders to take in the Palestinians, who some of them have very sweet, and they want them to remain there in Gaza, making the condition for the Israeli army, because what is at stake is what's the objective of each side. This part wants to make Israel look bad as possible to bring in Israel wants to decimate totally, as it did in 2021, 2006, peace and safety and security within the Gaza Strip. So time soon, or any other country opening up their border crossing to allow the Palestinians out, which will be counterintuitive, is beginning to morph. And remember that Iran has also placed a clear red line of incursion or invasion into Gaza will lead to genocide, and anything can happen from there.
Okay, we'll leave it there. We thank you. We apologize again because your voice is fading in and out for our viewers that noticed that. But we thank you for your contribution this morning, Mr. Onyekachi Adekoya, a security consultant who joined us from Lagos. Many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Still ahead. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says more than 200 Ukrainians have been evacuated from Israel. Please stay with us. Watching Channels Television's coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. Jordan's King Abdullah met with British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in London on Sunday to discuss the crisis in Gaza. His visit to the British capital is part of a European tour to garner support from the region's leaders for an end to the Israeli war on Gaza, as it's described by the Jordanian Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi. Jordan said on Saturday any move by Israel to impose a new displacement of Palestinians will push the region to the abyss of a wider regional conflict. The monarch, who met U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken on Friday, October the 13th, has had intensive contacts with leaders in the region and in the West to de-escalate the violence and prevent the region being dragged into a wider war. Officials say the king had also emphasized Jordan's refusal to accept the displacement of Palestinians from their land. Amman, which lost the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, to Israel during the 1967 Middle East War, is worried widening violence could have repercussions, with a large percentage of Jordan's population made up of Palestinians.
Well, sir, delighted to be back. I wish I was seeing you under better circumstances.
Iran's Foreign Minister Hossein Amirabdollahian arrived in Doha on Saturday and held meetings with Qatar's leadership, where they discussed the latest developments of the situation in Gaza and Israel. He met with Qatar's Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani on Saturday and Qatar's Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani on Sunday. He also met Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Doha, where the Iranian Foreign Minister supported and commended the rampage as a historic victory that has dealt a setback to Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory. In the United States, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said on Sunday that the Senate will push through a military aid package to help Israel in its war against the Hamas. He says, in his words, we will work to move this aid through the Senate ASAP, and the Israeli leaders made it clear to us they need the aid quickly, according to Schumer during a news conference in Tel Aviv. He says among Israel's requests are additional interceptors for its Iron Dome missile defense system, which has been operating non-stop, shooting down Hamas rockets from Gaza, as well as precision munition. He says the Senate will not wait for the House of Representatives to begin working on the bill, and also says that he told Israeli officials it was important to minimize civilian deaths in Gaza. Schumer traveled to Israel with other U.S. Senators Jackie Rosen, Mitt Romney, Bill Cassidy, and Mark Kelly, who also pledged unconditional support for Israel following the attacks by Hamas on October the 7th. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan warned on Sunday of the risk of conflict escalating in the Middle East and says the U.S. is trying to find safe passage for American citizens out of Gaza into Egypt. The Israeli military said on Sunday it will continue to allow Gazans to evacuate south ahead of an expected ground assault by its forces on the Gaza Strip in retaliation for the attacks inside Israel by the terrorist Hamas 8 days ago, that killed some 1,300 Israelis, mostly civilians. Mr. Sullivan, who spoke to news agencies, says, in his words, we see a real risk of escalation on the northern border and that the Biden administration is concerned about proxy forces and Lebanon's Hezbollah. Meanwhile, Israeli Defense Forces spokesman Lieutenant Colonel Peter Liner told news agencies that Hezbollah should be cautious of crossing the threshold as it observes what is happening to Hamas.
Well, first, with respect to the American citizens in Gaza, Martha, we have been working round the clock. We have an entire dedicated team that is working on nothing but this, helping American citizens who are in Gaza be able to get safe passage through the border crossing to Egypt. That has been difficult because of the ongoing operations and, frankly, because Hamas has intervened in some cases to make it hard for Palestinian Americans and others to be able to travel to the border crossing and get through. We're working that hard. Our goal is to ensure that every American who is in Gaza has safe passage out, and we will not rest until that happens. We are concerned. We see a real risk of escalation on the northern border, and that is why President Biden has been so clear and forceful in saying that no state and no group should seek to exploit this situation to their advantage or should escalate the conflict. And in fact, he has now sent the USS Eisenhower from the United States towards the region to give additional capacity to respond to any contingency and also to send a clear message of deterrence that no one should get involved in this, no one should escalate this. And the United States is showing that as well as saying that, and we will continue to monitor the situation closely on that northern border.
President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine said on Sunday more than 200 Ukrainians, mostly women and children, have been evacuated from Israel and taken to Romania. President Zelensky said at least 260 Ukrainians were still in the Gaza Strip, adding that Ukraine is working with its partners to evacuate citizens. Separately, Ukraine's embassy in Israel says on social media that 207 Ukrainian citizens, including 63 children, were evacuated from Tel Aviv to Romania on Saturday, and another flight to take 155 people out of Israel was planned for Sunday. Ukrainian Human Rights Ombudsman Dmytro Lebinets says Ukraine's foreign ministry sent a note of protest to Israel after Ukrainian citizens were not allowed to evacuate from Gaza on Saturday. Now joining us is Mr. Ambrose Igboke, the Chairman, Guild of Public Affairs Analysts from Enugu State in Enugu State. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Good morning, Olumide.
Good morning. As U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken embarked on his tour of the Middle East trying to douse tensions, King of Jordan, King Abdullah, met with the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in London, as we have reported. He says that an occupation of Gaza by Israel will not be tolerated. The Israel have said through their spokespeople and through the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, that there is no intention of Israel to occupy Gaza, but they are targeting Hamas. As this conflict continues, do you think you can separate one from the other, targeting Hamas and causing collateral damage on the innocent Palestinians?
Olumide, I don't think you can separate them. Over the years, we have seen the systems and the models being deployed by Hamas. Hamas has consistently used innocent Palestinians, especially innocent citizens, has consistently used them as human shield over the years. So what he does is they purposely implant themselves. Hamas implants themselves inside civilian populated areas. And Israel has accused Hamas so many times in the past years of releasing rocket launchers inside densely populated civilian areas and attack Israel from there. So sometimes when you want to retaliate those attacks, because Hamas has implanted themselves deep within the civilian population, it also affects civilians. And these are the tactics of Hamas over the years. And the funny thing is that, the curious thing is that the Palestinian government it does not condemn Hamas. You know, the Palestinian citizens, most of them don't condemn Hamas when they fight in the name of fighting for Palestinians. And that is the big problem we have been having over the years. So when this happened, I think the proportion was not expected. The proportion was so high. It was so huge and so massive that even those who were backing Hamas started balking, like Iran, for example, that have been supplying weapons, money, and funded Hamas over the years. For the first time, denied being a part of this. But we all know that Iran is an integral part of enablers of Hamas. So, coming to what you asked, it is very difficult to actually, delineate where the Hamas terrorists are located and where the citizens of other citizens of Palestine are located, because they are integrated somehow. They are inside the population, and Hamas always uses them as human shield. So when you strike a Hamas, base, you are sure to get civilian casualties, and that is a dilemma about this war, because it is not a linear warfare where you have defined troops, where you have defined locations and you fight, the soldiers fight. This is asymmetrical warfare, unlike the Yom Kippur War that happened in 1973, or like the 1967 war and some other wars that have happened between Israel and Palestine and other neighbors in the Middle East, which was more of military engaging the military. This one is a full-scale war that does not involve those kind of linear warfare. This is purely asymmetric. So when you are bombing Hamas locations, you are surely to be bombing civilians. And that is the irony of this war.
It was Israeli President Isaac Herzog that says that the Israelis have no intention of occupying Gaza. Hamas, we've been told, have a complex network of underground tunnels, some as much as 200 kilometers in length, that they've been building over the years, and that possibly is the location for some of their operations. And the entries to some of those tunnels are in civilian places, such as markets or apartment blocks. So it makes a very difficult situation even more complicated for the Israeli special forces or soldiers who want to extricate these hostages. Now we're told about 155 hostages being held hostage by Hamas in these possibly underground bunkers. Do you think that, as per the escalation of the war into a wider conflict, the presence of the two aircraft carrier groups, the USS Gerald R. Ford and the Dwight D. Eisenhower, is enough as a sufficient deterrent to Hezbollah, Lebanon, to Syria, and to Iran?
Just like what I said earlier, you have just corroborated it by saying that the tunnels that were built were in civilian areas, civilian populated areas. These are the tactics of Hamas, for those who have been following Hamas over the last 50 years. I mean, these have been their tactics. And they use people as human shield, so that the international community, just like what is happening now, the international community is crying foul, saying that Israel is bombing civilian locations and the rest. But the international community have not been able to condemn Hamas for using civilian locations as a place for launching attacks, as a place for military zones, as a place for building military armament and all those things. And so we must condemn both sides. We really want to speak truth to facts. We must condemn Israel, we must condemn Hamas. But we will first of all condemn Hamas by putting civilians in harm's way. Why will you build military formations, military installations, military hardware inside civilian locations? That means you are firstly bringing the civilians into harm's way. Secondly, it means you don't even care what happens to the civilians. Most of them see it as see Hamas as another arm of a government. Meanwhile, Hamas is a terrorist organization. So if you see, if the Palestinians are seeing Hamas as their savior, as the people who can fight Israel, while the Palestinian government pretends to that Hamas is not part of them, then it is paradoxical, because if you have a terrorist organization that is doing your bit and killing people, but they cannot be owned responsible, they cannot be held responsible because they are not a legal state, then we have issues. And that is exactly what is also happening part of Russia, where the Wagner Group was used, to implement things that a legitimate government could not do. These are the things the world global bodies should not, look away from and should be tackled headlong. We cannot have mercenaries, we cannot have terrorists, bombing other legitimate nations. And when the legitimate nations respond, we start saying, oh, international war conventions, this. But when the terrorists were operating, because they're not a legal entity, you cannot actually hold them against Geneva Conventions on war and all some of these things. And that is the balance we need to strike in terms of this condemnation. We should go beyond the consequences of actions of a non-state actor and start blaming the consequences of response of a state actor. And these are the things we need to start looking at if we really want to tackle this thing headlong. When you talk of the aircraft carriers that have been stationed, and the second one is on its way, it's a pure deterrent, and I think it will do the job of deterring Iran. But fortunately, Iran has said they were not involved. But over the years, you can't trust Iran with these kind of statements because they can come up with surprises. So the United States have been very emphatic in the support of Israel against this, I will call it existential threat, against this invasion. Because when people
We do apologize. Mr. Ambrose Igboke was speaking to us about the crisis in the Middle East. I will try and reestablish that connection with him, which we've lost, and we understand is back again. Yes, we do. Please go ahead.
So I was saying that, it's not proper. So we should be able to, Iran can spring surprises, so you cannot take Iran with their words. So this will act as a deterrent, because Iran has been funding Hezbollah and even Hamas over the years, supplying them sophisticated weapons and all those things. So if the America does not did not pose this military force and might as a deterrent for Iran, they might as well, ask Hezbollah already. Hezbollah has been releasing some rockets already, and they have been posturing for war. So I feel this will be a deterrent, because if Iran goes ahead, or Syria or Lebanon goes ahead to attack Israel in this conundrum that is happening, I don't think the U.S. will also will not hesitate to take action. Now, for those who have been clamoring and blaming Israel for the high proportion of force they are using, those countries that are talking, I don't think any of them will sit idly and allow, whether it be a terrorist organization or even a legitimate government, to attack, to invade their country, because Israel was invaded. I mean, we saw what happened in 1945 when the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor and bombed the American admiral ships in Pearl Harbor. We saw what America responded with. The force was, reverberating to today. They dropped atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that was a deterrent to so many people. If you go and invade Russia and see what happens, go invade China and see what happens to you.
Do you see, Mr. Igboke? Do you now see that this conflict has become, if you can still hear me, are you still there?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Therefore, having peace in the Middle East, is it survival of the fittest and not so much who is right and who is wrong? Because the Palestinians have propounded their own reasons for which they think is legitimate, that they will support Hamas, which uses this disproportionate force and violence against Israelis. And the Israelis have also made their position clear historically and currently that they will not budge, neither will Hamas. Has Hamas put too much faith in the Arab nations around it to intervene? Have they put all their eggs in one basket? Because it seems if those nations don't intervene, that is Syria, that is Lebanon, that is Iran, and help them militarily, they are fighting a lost cause, because militarily speaking, Israel is stronger.
Well, the problem now is that I think Hamas should reevaluate its philosophy and ideology. Because, I mean, the world is no longer what it was in 1948. The world was not what it was in 1967. The world is not what it was in 1973, 1978, and all this, even in the current 2000s and 2014. The world is not what it was anymore. The world is trying to, abrogate what causes war. Now, the Egypt you have in the 70s, look at what is happening in the United Arab Emirates. They are actually transforming, into a global destination, a war tourism destination. So they will not want to be involved in a war that will, stop their, inflow of tourists from all over the world. The same thing with Saudi Arabia. You can see that Saudi Arabia is changing a lot of its laws, allowing women to drive cars, even having football leagues that bring players from all over the world. The dynamics are changing. The economic dynamics are changing. The same thing with Egypt and other, Middle East countries. So what they are doing is they are opening up more to the world, and they don't want things that will give them, a negative perception that will drive away foreign direct investments in their locations and the rest. So Hamas should know that these other countries are also having their own internal problems. They're also having their own internal agenda. They also have internal visions for their own people. So when they try, what Hamas always tries to do is go cook up a problem, delivers it, and then try to drag the whole of the Arab world, or even sometimes they call on the religion, to come all over the world and support them. I think that tactic is old. That tactic should not work again. What Hamas can be doing in concert with whoever is supporting them is trying to find a lasting solution. Because if you say you want to obliterate Israel from that entity, you cannot. The same thing, Israel cannot say Palestinians cannot be that entity. So they should learn, because when you track the archaeological history and even written history all over the time, you'll find out that both of them had inherited those places thousands of years ago. And the Palestinians have been there for like 1,300 years. And that is even enough to say that you own the land. But again, people own the land before you. And from the history, we will see that how the Jewish people disappeared, and they tried to converge in 1948 and the rest. So the two-state solution that have been said should be, should not only be mouthed by the United Nations, should no longer just be spoken in conferences and all that, should be actualized. And then when you do that, when you provide it, we should not wait for Hamas or for Palestine or whatever to agree. We should come to United Nations and define these things. After all, in Africa, what happened in Africa in 1885, in a Berlin conference, where Africa was facilitated and partitioned, and nobody came to ask Africans whether Yorubas who were in Benin Republic wanted to be part of Nigeria or not. They just used pencil and decimated that. And that is the geographical boundaries we are seeing, following up to today. And so what happened in the old Soviet Union, where countries also were facilitated and they had their own identity. So the world must put its foot on ground this time and find a solution and sit down and create a boundaries with all the Arab nations. And if Hamas doesn't want to be there, that is good. If Palestine wants to be there, that is good. But there must be a solution to have some specific boundary, globally recognized, so that tomorrow, if Israel crosses that boundary, then we know that we are invading another country. Or if Hamas or Palestine or any country crosses that boundary, then we know that you are declaring an act of war on that country. But when we hide under all kinds of polemics and then do not take concrete action, and then we allow Hamas to operate as an illegal group over the years, and then we don't expect Israel to retaliate, or Israel is shooting on Palestinian citizens. I mean, these are things that have been going on for too long, and the world must wake up and solve the Middle East crisis once and for all.
Mr. Ambrose Ugoke, thank you so much for your contribution this morning. It's greatly appreciated.
Thank you very much, Olumide, for having me.
Mr. Ambrose Ugoke is the chairman, Guild of Public Affairs Analysts, Enugu State Chapter. You're watching Channels Television's coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. Stay with us more after the break, as there is support around the world for Israel and Palestine. to the final stretch of this morning's coverage of the Israeli-Hamas war. Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich said on Sunday the government was taking responsibility for the devastating attack that allowed Hamas to enter Israel and kill hundreds of Israeli civilians. He says in his words, "We have to admit honestly, painfully, and with a bowed head, we, the state leadership and the security establishment, have failed in maintaining the security of our citizens." Smotrich is a key partner in Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government, said in a news conference. He also said in his words, "We failed to implement the unwritten contract, the first of its kind between the state and its citizens. A contract that was written in blood and is now stained with blood." Families of Israelis taken hostage or killed during the Hamas attack met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Sunday. The families called on the Prime Minister to ensure their release. Israel is carrying out the most intense bombardment Gaza has ever seen in response to the killing of 1,300 people when Hamas fighters rampaged through Israeli towns on October the 7th. They shot dead men, women, children, and soldiers, and they seized hostages in the worst attack on civilians in Israel's history. Authorities in Gaza said at least 2,670 people so far, Palestinians, have been killed by Israel's retaliatory strikes, a quarter of them children, and nearly 10,000 wounded. Hospitals are running short on supply and struggling to cope with the numbers of the wounded. Medics and volunteers were seen rushing to Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital today after they were injured in an Israeli airstrike. 5 medics were killed in the attack, according to a hospital statement. Overwhelmed by the shortage in medical supplies, water and power, Shifa Hospital, one of Gaza's main and biggest healthcare facilities, has been struggling to keep up with the non-stop injuries and storing dead bodies. Meanwhile, a Palestinian doctor in Gaza warned of an impending health disaster as hospitals run low on fuel and basic medical supplies. In its response to the devastating October 7th assault from Gaza by the group Hamas, Israel has imposed a total blockade, halting food supplies and cutting electricity to Gaza. A week after that began, shops are running out of many items, although now Israel say they've turned on water in the southern part. The United Nations urges Israel to avert a humanitarian catastrophe, a slither of land with 2.3 million people wedged between Israel, Egypt, and the Mediterranean Sea. More than 2,000 people have died since Israel began its retaliation for the attacks by Hamas on the country last Saturday. Associate Professor of International Relations and Diplomacy, Dr. Mukhtar Imam, says while it's impossible for Israeli forces to distinguish Hamas from innocent civilians, it does not absolve Israel of bearing responsibility in Palestinian frustration and aggression over the realization of statehood.
Hamas is struggling for what every other Palestinian is struggling for. And so Hamas is more or less an ideology. And so it becomes extremely difficult for you to talk about attacking certain individuals who basically are the protagonists or the front runners of this ideology without having civilian casualties. It's absolutely impossible. And that's the reason why there is the need to look at this situation from a holistic perspective. Unfortunate and regrettable as the current situation is in Palestine, the reality is that it was a time bomb waiting to explode. Sooner or later, it was obvious that this sort of situation would have unfolded. Again, like I said, unfortunate as the situation is, because what the frustration aggression theorists have alluded to over the years is exactly what was seen playing out here. Frustration naturally leads to aggression. And so where you have a situation where people are being decapitated, people are being killed, time and time again, and this is not something that you take from me, this is something that the international community has also accepted. Just last year, over 300 Palestinians were killed from the Al-Aqsa compound through Jenin and so on. One of your colleagues, as a matter of fact, was involved, the Al Jazeera reporter, Abu Akhli. And so basically, you see that these things have been ongoing and ongoing. Every other year, there's this casualty situation and so on and so forth. So basically, I don't see a way where the Israelis will retaliate given the circumstances without having civilian casualty. And to put it bluntly, they have never really given a thought to civilian casualties in all of the wars that we have seen over the years.
Also on Sunday, thousands of people took to the streets of central Madrid to show their solidarity with the Palestinian people and condemn Israel's bombardment of Gaza. The crowd chanted, "Israel, terrorist state," and held signs which read, "We are all Palestinian." The government delegation said 10,000 people attended the march, which was organized by Palestinian groups based in Spain. Around 1,000 people have paid tribute to the Israeli victims of last week's Hamas attack with a candlelit vigil in London. They also called for the return of more than 100 people taken hostage during the assault on Israeli towns and kibbutzes. The vigil was held the day after a Palestine Solidarity campaign demonstration at the same location condemning Israel's retaliatory attacks on Hamas targets in Gaza and the blockade of the enclave. British Foreign Minister James Cleverly earlier on Sunday says Britain remains supportive of Israel's right to defend itself, but has urged it to show restraint in any military action against Hamas in order to minimize harm to civilians. Finally, hundreds of demonstrators turned out in Dallas, Texas to march in support of Palestinians as the war between Israel and the Palestine group Hamas rages on. Protesters carried flags and banners calling for freedom as they chanted and marched peacefully in Dallas' Akkad Plaza. The Dallas Palestine Coalition organized the event. And that's it for this morning's coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you for watching.